My name is Helen Day. I'm Vice President of the Friends of Maple Grove Cemetery. So welcome back to Maple Grove and welcome to anyone who hasn't been here before. We do have this room, which is the celebration hall, which celebrates life. And we have it set up for various ways. We're having an immigrant's tea next Saturday. If anyone's interested, we have flyers available downstairs. And we also put on concerts in this room, and so we set it up with the chairs in rows so that people can enjoy the music. And we have a lovely Steinway piano that's often the focal point of those concerts. If you look on our website, friendsofmaplegrove.org, you will find many, many events that are coming up for the season. And we have a huge amount of events in our archives from the past. This coming week, we do have an evening of poetry. If you know, this is National Poetry Month. And so Kew Gardens is also celebrating poetry with a day today, which is, I don't know if it's national or state, but it's Poem in Your Pocket Day. And in Kew Gardens, they have an open mic at the corner of 83rd Avenue and Lefferts Boulevard, where you could read a favorite piece of poetry or something that you have written. And so we have been posting on Facebook various poetry that has been written of or about Maple Grove or by people who are buried here at Maple Grove. And we were amazed at the number of really beautiful pieces of poetry that we found. And this Thursday, we'll have a gentleman here by the name of Salgado Maranjo, and he is from Buenos Aires, Brazil, and he's on a national tour for his 5th book of poetry. He came from nothing, from poverty in Buenos Aires, and has become one of the most famous figures in poetry in Buenos Aires. And he's touring the United States with his books and his translator, because he doesn't speak English. But his books are all in translation, so they're published in both Portuguese and English. And so, as part of that tour, they asked if he could come to Maple Grove and read some of his poetry. So it's free. He's coming here Thursday night at 7 o'clock, so that's April 27th, right here in this room. He will have some books for sale, and he'll do book signings as well. We'll do a reception, just as we will do today. After June's presentation, we'll go downstairs and we have some refreshments for everyone. And you can check out our art gallery down there. We have a beautiful art exhibit called Immigrants Untold Stories, which ties in with our tea next weekend, which is the Ellis Island tea. So celebrating our immigrants and celebrating those who came to Ellis Island. And in this room, we have a fabulous photo exhibit taken by a young man who had traveled from his homeland in Singapore and to go to school in Canada, but he didn't do it the conventional way. He hitchhiked west through Asia, through southern Russia, into Europe, onto a freighter that took him to North Carolina, and hitchhiked up into Canada so he could go to school. He did this when he was 20 and wrote a book about it called The Long Direction. And so he's coming on Saturday to speak as our keynote speaker at the tea. And right now he is teaching flying. He teaches flying for Cessna small planes, and he is a language teacher as well. He tutors at least 1 or 2 languages. He speaks about 5 languages. He's just an amazing, amazing guy, and he's over 24. So he is going to be quite an interesting fellow to hear. And to see his photographs that he took on his travels, a picture of the freighter is over there, and some of the travels through Vietnam and various other countries. And they're all labeled. In 10 months it took him to get across. So we meet some fascinating people. And we also do research for all the fascinating people that are buried behind us. There's at least 117,000, yep. I think. We had to verify that total because it keeps growing. And so there are so many wonderful stories out there. And that reflects the Egyptian proverb that is inscribed on the doorway downstairs into the columbarium. That's an old Egyptian proverb, and it says, to say the name of the dead is to bring them back to life. And so our research has brought the stories of those buried behind us back to life so that we can talk about them and their accomplishments and see what they went through and to honor them. And so today we honor a man whose name was George Mason, and he was actually a prisoner in Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia during the Civil War, and he's buried here. And that will tie into the presentation that you will hear in a few minutes that will talk about Libby Prison and about our Civil War spy, Elizabeth Van Lew. So now I'd like to present June McGowan, and she will tell us about her relative, Elizabeth Van Lew. And I thank you, and make sure your cell phones are off. If you need the restrooms, they're downstairs on the lower level at the back to the left of the waterfall. Anything else, Paul?
Yeah, I'm the president of the Friends of
Yes.
Naked Rome. My name is Paul Galinas, so thank you for coming. We are a unique cemetery, the only cemetery in the world with a concert hall like this. We also have a gallery downstairs that revolves every month with different presentations of local artists. So we are quite unique, and so we have many different partnerships with different historical societies in Queens. And we're trying to become a mini version of Greenwood Cemetery, which is in Brooklyn. So, and I've told the borough president that quite often. All right, so thank you very much, and I would like further introduction for
Yes,
June,
thank you.
and I'll be hitting the slideshows.
And I just reminded myself I better show up myself.
Yes, that's
Yes.
right. Always a good thing to do.
And there'll be refreshments after
Yes.
downstairs.
How's that? All right? Everyone can hear? Okay. My name is June McGowan, and I want to talk to you today about my cousin Elizabeth. Elizabeth Van Lew was a spy master. She was born of great wealth down in Virginia, in Richmond, and she gave it all up so that she could free slaves and that she could preserve the Union. That was her main claim. And I want to first show you this particular slide. Here. Oh, I'm sorry. It's hard for me to move around. Can I take this off?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that'll work better, I think. Okay. Our first slide here is just, and I'm sorry there's a little bit of light on it, so I'm having trouble seeing. Okay, it's basically the flyer that was sent out. It shows Elizabeth as a middle-aged woman, and it also shows the spy cipher that she prepared, that she invented really, and it also shows Libby Prison. Now we go to the next slide, we're going to tell you about Elizabeth's family. This isn't just a story about Elizabeth, it's a story about her family, the ones who came before her and shaped her beliefs, and also about the people that she interacted with during her lifetime. Okay, our next slide here is all about the family tree for the Van Lewens. Now, the first Van Lewen, his name was Frederick Hendrickson. Hendrickson was his father's name, and the first Dutch settlers used their father's name as their surname. Van Lewen is actually his identity. It's telling you that he came from the town of Leeuwen, which is in Holland, and it's in what they call the Gelderland, which is the northern part. It's a beautiful country. I was there last year, and although I've been many times to Holland, this was really the first time I spent an entire week there and actually saw a lot of the Gelderland. It's beautiful farmland, lovely rivers flowing, and it was settled by the Flemish in about the 13th century, and they actually brought the Catholic religion up there. So if you find any Catholics today in Holland, that's where you're going to find them. Now he used it to identify himself so we could separate him from other Frederick Hendricksons that might be around. And it just means that he came from the town of Leeuwen. Now, when the English took over, I think it was 1664, and they demanded two things of the Dutch settlers. They wanted them to take a surname because every generation their name changed. And as a result, it would drive the English crazy. So they said, let's adopt surnames. And second of all, they had to, of course, take an oath to the English king and promise to obey them and their rules. Well, Mr. Van Leeuwen, the very first one that came, he settled first with Flatbush, but then he moved out to the town of Jamaica. And after he took the oath of allegiance, he then selected a surname. He did not select Van Leeuwen, the town he came from, although many people did do that. Because Van Leeuwen is actually a very popular name over in Holland. It's the 18th most popular name. And today, there are still 2 Van Leeuwen towns in the Delta land. And the reason there's 2 of them is because in 1898, they built a Catholic church, a very large Catholic church there, and the town split. It's actually hyphenated, the names are now, and one part will tell you that it's the Catholic town, and the other one will tell you that it's the Protestant town. Now, Mr. Van Leeuwen instead decided to take the name Van Loo, now instead of Van Leeuwen. Now, Van Loo is not known at all in Holland. So if you have a Van Loo, you know you came from this Mr. Van Loo. It's unique. All of these first Dutch settlers did not have a surname, or most of them. Some of them did, but they actually came from other countries. There were French Huguenots that lived there. But Mr. Van Loo was a Dutchman, and he took the name then Van Loo. There were various spellings of Van Loo. Eventually, it turned out that a lot of them used Van Loo, L-E-W. And I think the reason they did that was because the people, if you hear the name Van Loo, that's the natural way you're going to spell it. Now, if we follow the family tree down, we have our first settler, then we come down to the 3rd generation there, who would be Frederick. Now, Frederick was married to an English girl, or a girl of English descent, I should say. Her mother was Sarah Cornell. I'm sorry, his wife was Mary Betts. Her mother was Sarah Cornell, and her father was Richard Betts III. If I told you about the Cornell Betts family, we'd be ordering takeout for breakfast, so I'm not getting into that today. But I will tell you that they are buried in the Grace Episcopal Church, Sarah and Richard, and they have those old brownstone headstones, you know, tombstones, that are very legible. You can still read them today, a couple of 100 years later. You go right in the front gate, and they're right to the right side in that cemetery. Now, Frederick is Elizabeth's ancestor. It comes down through several Johns to him, but she is directly descended from Frederick. Now, I am also directly descended from Frederick through his daughter, Aletta. Aletta married Thomas Smith, and actually they're connected to Southside Cemetery and the White Horse Snedeker Cemetery. Now, also there is a 3rd child from Frederick. His 3rd child is named Frederick, and through him there is another descendant that will fit into our story later on. Okay, I think we can move on to the next one. Well, there's a picture of Prospect Cemetery there, because they are all buried in Prospect Cemetery. And this is a picture of Elizabeth. She's middle-aged there. And she is described when she was young as being very pretty, blonde curls, beautiful blue eyes, but middle-aged and being a spinster wasn't kind to her, they said. So she has kind of angular features, and you know, she became a little sharp-tongued too, they said. This is also a picture of their home. They lived in Richmond on Church Hill, which happened to be well named because there was a church there, and a very famous church. Right across the street was the St. John's Church where Patrick Henry gave his speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." So they were kind of surrounded by history there. Okay, I think we can go on to the next one. Okay, this is a bill of sale. Elizabeth's grandparents, John Van Loo, Frederick's son, and his wife Sarah, were actually losing their property in Jamaica. This tells us that they took out a loan in 18, my copy is very blurry.
1816 in the bottom it says.
Yeah, well that's the date of the sale. But they took out a loan, okay, 1807, I see it now. And they promised to pay it back in a year's time, and they didn't pay for it. So here we are in 1816, and they're actually going to sell their property at public auction. They're losing their family farm. The reason this is significant because the date of this auction is going to be in 1816. And that is the year that Elizabeth's father decided to find his fortune elsewhere, and he moved down to Richmond, Virginia. Now, you'll be happy to know that the family farm was not lost. I don't know if Elizabeth's father was able to get enough funds together quickly to save it, or what actually happened, but we did find another article that in 1834, the farm was again being sold, but this time by the widow Sarah. Her husband had died. Like widows always, she was downsizing. She was selling the farm. So we know it was saved. But now we also know that Elizabeth's father has moved down to Richmond. And we can move on to the next one. And this is where they end up living, but not right away. When he arrives in there in 1816, he goes into the hardware business in a partnership with Dr. John Adams. Now, Dr. John Adams comes from a very prominent family, and he built this beautiful home in 1802 on Church Hill. Now, he got into a lot of ventures. Not only was he a doctor, but he became a mayor. He is credited with building up the city of Richmond. He built a beautiful hotel, 4-story hotel. For its time, it was like the Waldorf Astoria of Richmond. It was absolutely gorgeous. And he did a lot of work, and he got into this partnership with John Van Leeuw. But unfortunately, the doctor did overextend himself, as often happens, and he started to lose his properties one after the other. The hardware business went, the house went, the hotel went, and he went into bankruptcy. Now, according to Elizabeth, her father's share of the hardware business was a $100,000 debt. Now, that was quite a bit of money. Now, he honorably, as she said, paid all his debts off, picked himself up, and started another hardware business on his own, which became hugely successful. In time, the Van Leeuw family moved into the Adams house. They were living there by 1829, and by 1836, they actually purchased it. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Okay, this is a beautiful shot of what the house looked like in 1836. When John bought it, he improved on a house that was already beautiful. He actually built more floors on it. He put in a beautiful garden that extended all the way down to the James River and had a little summer house down there. And he also had, in the parlor, they had brocaded silk on the walls, chandeliers, marble fireplaces. It was the showpiece of Richmond, Virginia. And of course, he had many, many famous people come through. Now this supposedly, it looks like a postcard to me. This supposedly is what the house looked like in 1836. And if you notice right there in the tiny people in the corner, that's the family sitting outside their sun house there, down by the water. It was actually on the James River. Okay? Now we're going to switch gears. We're going to leave Elizabeth's father on the Dutch side here, and we're going to switch to her mother's family, who are German. Now, this is Elizabeth's grandfather, her mother's father. He was born Johann Hilarius Becker in Germany, and he came here at the age of 11 with his family. Now, they changed their name to Baker, anglicized it from Becker, and he became Hilary Baker. Now, he was a rather ambitious young man too, and by the age of 21, he's only here 10 years, he's already what they call an ironmonger. He's involved in a partnership with an iron forge. And of course, they live in Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia, and the obvious answer is that the iron forge is Valley Forge. So if you bring us up to 1777, 1778, we all know who was at Valley Forge. Washington had his encampment there. And here's the story about Mr. Baker. Mr. Baker had, of course, access to Philadelphia, that's where he lived, and Philadelphia was taken, of course, over by the English. It was occupied by them. So he goes out to the forge, and he gets a wagon, and he's going over to Washington's encampment to deliver things. Well, there's no proof of it, but tradition says that Mr. Baker was not only bringing supplies to the fort, but he was also bringing secrets. His wagon had an empty bottom where he put secret information that he obtained in Philadelphia. So if all of this is true, Mr. Baker is the first spy in the Vanderbilt family, not Elizabeth. Actually, they said he formed a lifelong friendship with George Washington too, and maybe that's why he later gets into politics. And I think we can move on to the next one. And here we are in 1791. Mr. Baker is an alderman in Philadelphia, and he has become like one of the founding people of the Abolitionist Society of Pennsylvania, which, by the way, Benjamin Franklin was one of the people, one of the members there, and it was the first abolitionist society in the country. Now, Mr. Baker here, as an alderman, has more or less, I guess, notarized, I would say, this particular document. Now, this document is presented at a friend's meeting. And the reason is because the document testifies that Thomas Walmsley has freed his slaves. If you're going to be a member of the Quakers do not believe in slavery. To be a member of good standing, you have to free your slaves. Now, in a little bit of a touch of irony, my dad originally came from Pennsylvania, and his mother's family, they traced their ancestry back to the first Quakers. And Thomas Walmsley, not this one, but his ancestor, is counted as one of my great-grandfathers. So we tie in there with the Walmsley family, and actually I found this piece of information while searching for my father's family. So we can move on to the next one. Okay, now 5 short years later, in 1796, Mr. Baker is now the mayor of Philadelphia. And he founds in 1797, the following year, he finds the police force. It's the first time they have a uniform paid police force in Philadelphia. And he establishes them because he wants them to prevent looting and vandalism in the city. And he has 20 policemen on duty during the day, 15 at night. And the following year, in 1798, the yellow fever epidemic hits. Now, this is the second time in 5 years, and probably that's one reason they needed the police force, because they probably had problems earlier. Now, as the mayor, he's also the superintendent of the police force. And unfortunately, what happens to Mr. Baker, he catches yellow fever. He did not want to leave his city. He didn't think it was fair. He also did not want to leave his policemen. After all, they were working there to keep the peace. He felt he belonged there. So he dies of yellow fever. And he leaves 5 young children. Actually, Elizabeth's mother, who is his daughter Eliza, is only months old. And so Mr. Baker then, sadly, as I say, passes away, and we have the next slide, which is his obituary. And they're talking in his obituary about what a wonderful person he is, a humane and virtuous magistrate, because he has not left his city. He was one who watched over with an affectionate parent, like an affectionate parent. Okay, so here we have the next one. And, whoops, we have his obituary, okay. Alrighty, we'll move on then. Okay, so Eliza's mother dies in 1808. So at the age of 10, Eliza Baker is now orphaned. This is Elizabeth's mother. And I'm sure some type of guardian must have been appointed, either as an older relative or somebody took care of her. But she then marries John Van Loo, and it's said that she meets him when he's on a business trip to Pennsylvania, and he brings her back as his bride and all this, but really not too true. I came across a newspaper article that was really like a society article down in Richmond. And it told how Eliza Baker Van Loo was possibly the sister of Hillary Baker, a civic leader in Richmond. So I started looking for Hillary Baker. There can't be too many of them. So I assumed he was related. And I found out that her brother, actually, after the mother's death, he was 19 years of age, he got out I found a document that they called a Seamen's Protection Document. And this protected the seamen, particularly during the time around the War of 1812, because they were being oppressed by the British and taking on board their ships. So he had this document that he was going to sail out of the port of Philadelphia, rather. So I don't know what happened, but between 1809 and 1813, he ends up in Virginia, in Richmond, and he ends up, excuse me, being part of the, okay, sorry. He becomes part of the Richmond civic leaders. And he also is also a member of the War of 1812 down in Virginia. And by 1813, he builds this beautiful home. So in 4 years, he did pretty good. And guess where this home is located? It's right across the street from Dr. Adams' house, where the Van Loos are going to be living. So I don't think that John Van Loo went on a business trip to Philadelphia. If he went up there to claim Eliza as his bride, I think it was kind of orchestrated. Because I can't imagine that Hillary Baker and John Van Loo didn't get to know each other by living across the street from each other. And I can't imagine, since they were the same age and both Northerners, that they didn't have a lot in common and become good friends. And Eliza is now 20 years old. She's had a guardian raising her since she's 10. They're trying to find her a husband, let's be honest. And I think Hillary probably said to John Van Loo, my friend, have I got a girl for you? And he introduced her to his sister, because we know he didn't bring her back there to Richmond as his bride, because the plaque on Hillary Baker's house tells us they were married in that house, John Van Loo and Eliza Baker. So I think my scenario is a little better than what I read in the books. But anyway, I was wondering how poor Hillary fit in when his niece became a spy during the war. But sadly, Mr. Baker died at the age of 40. 50. He died in 1840 at the age of 50. So he really wasn't involved at all in the Civil War, but his children were. He had a son who was a druggist at the time of the war, and he ended up being inducted into the Confederate Army, and he was also a physician, like a druggist, in a medical hospital for the Confederacy. But in 1957, as we can see by the plaque, the Historic Richmond Association took over the house and restored it. Today it's lived in by a private family, absolutely gorgeous. I've seen pictures of the interior. It's all of the same time period, back into the 1800s. Beautiful home. Okay, we'll move on. And that's actually a picture of Hillary Baker's tombstone. He had an old one, as you can see behind it, which is not legible anymore. So in 2018, Friends of the Choctaw Cemetery, where they're all buried, put up this new stone showing his military service. Okay? And here we have some pictures of the Van Loo house. Now, John Van Loo and Eliza are married. They have 3 children. He's very successful. Everything's going great. They have this beautiful home. 1829, 7 years later, they actually purchase it, and he does all this work on it. And we can see several pictures here. This is one, he added the back portico, but he hasn't added the gardens as yet. This one shows the gardens. And in 1850 census, they actually had a gardener living in their home, a young man that came from Ireland. And he must have worked in that garden every day for all day, I guess, to keep it going. And we can see a little glimpse of Elizabeth there with the bushes. She's standing there all dressed in black. with an umbrella over her head. And in the other far picture, she's actually sitting on a bench, so she managed to get herself in a lot of the pictures. Okay, we can move on. All right, Mr. Van Loo. Life is really great, but unfortunately in 1843 he passes away too. And his will is rather unusual. He leaves mostly his assets to his wife, and they're quite considerable. In 1850 census, the property is valued at $91,000. And if they tell you that $10,000 in those days was worth $200,000 today, you can imagine what that property was worth. So they are very wealthy. They own the adjoining properties also. But we have an 1840 census that shows that John Van Loo actually had 15 slaves at the time. Not only were they used in the household, but they were probably used in the hardware business. And they owned a little farm. There was nowhere as a plantation. It was just providing goods for the family. And he leaves in his will a notation that none of his slaves can be freed or sold. And that's probably because Elizabeth, his daughter, had been sent away to school. She went up to Philadelphia, she went to a Quaker school there, and she came back with what they said was abolitionist ideas. And supposedly she was after her father to free these slaves. And so he wrote it right in his will. Of course, the family didn't pay too much attention to it, and eventually they did free all their slaves. But for now, we're just looking at the tombstone of Mr. Van Loo, who, like his brother-in-law, died tragically young. Okay? And this is Elizabeth. It's a picture of her when she was a young girl, and I believe it's probably a painting. And as they say, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, and we're beholding a very beautiful young girl there. Of course, painters often made their subjects far more attractive than they were, because that's how they made their money. They got commissions then. So there's a picture of Elizabeth as a young girl. And she, when her father died, she's 25 years old. She's been out in society and everything, but she doesn't show much interest in getting married or anything. She lives with her mother. She's very close to her mother. And she just keeps on growing closer. And she has a great influence over the mother. As I mentioned, she gets the mother to free the slaves. Between 1850 and 1860, they're all freed. However, the people of Virginia don't know this. It's kind of kept quiet. They just think it's kind of strange that the Van Loo slaves have a lot more freedom than they would give their slaves. They're out there living wherever they would like. They're not living on the premises of the Van Loo family. They're getting little salaries and everything, but they do keep the fact that they're freed quiet. Okay, now, there are 3 children born. There's a daughter in between. Elizabeth was born in 1818. Anna Paulina was born in 1820. No picture of Anna Paulina. And she actually gets married in January 1844, just a few months after her father. And she marries a man called Joseph Clapp. He's a doctor. He comes from a large family of physicians in the Philadelphia area. And they promptly moved to Philadelphia, and she's out of the picture. We don't hear again about her for 20 years until the Civil War, and then she gets back into the picture again. She has 8 children, 5 girls, 3 boys. 2 of the boys become physicians also, and some of her son-in-laws are physicians. They live a very comfortable house, in a comfortable house, and a very luxurious lifestyle up in Philadelphia, and she's very happy up there. The 3rd child is 1827. He was born. This is John Newton. And John Newton is the heir. After the father dies, he takes over the hardware business. He's only 16 years old, and he takes it over. And it seems to everyone's surprise, he takes it over quite successfully, too. Now, John Newton, rather, gets married in 1854. And he marries a girl called Mary Carter West. Mary Carter West is a true Southern girl. Her lineage is that she's descended from Thomas West, the first governor of Virginia, and also her mother is a Randolph Carter, which they're all over the place down in Virginia. It's a very strange affair because she is such a Southerner. She has two brothers that are in the Civil War and in the Confederate Army. And it's not a good marriage, let's put it that way, because the family feels that she's got these sympathies that are quite opposite of theirs. And there's talk that, they tossed her out of the house and everything. There was two children born to the marriage, two girls, Annie and Eliza. Now, we really don't know what happened to Mary Carter West. She kind of just disappears from public view. And it's quite strange. Some people said she died in 1872, that she was kind of just an outcast in the family. But I found that hard to believe. That I think what happened was because he was being married at that particular time, again, John Newton, that they decided that was probably her death date. But just the other day I came up with a piece of information on an application that their grandchild made in 1965 to join the Sons of the Revolution. And he lists her death date as March of 1861. And that would be just weeks before the Civil War started. So I can't understand. She's supposed to be buried in Stockton Cemetery. There's no records in the cemetery. So what happened to this young mother is a surprise. Because how could somebody only in their late 20s with two small children, attached to one of the wealthiest families in Virginia, just die unnoticed? There's no obituaries, there's nothing. So I really don't know what happened to her. But I do know that she couldn't go home to her parents because her mother died in 1857, her father died the year later. And his father's will is a little bit strange too. He leaves his properties to his sons, and they do have sizable property because they inherited it from the very first West. They live in a plantation called Belfield, which Mary Carter West was actually born and where they married. So the father in his will has his property is left to his two sons. He also leaves his daughters to his sons, which I thought was a little odd. His oldest daughter is like 20, and his youngest is about 10. There's quite an age gap there, so she maybe became like that when his mother. So he tells the one son in the will that he has to take his two sisters. He tells his other son that he has to take these other sisters. And he gives the girls some cash, and he gives them all a slave. But John Van Lew, and this is the exact way the father put it in his will, he said, "My son-in-law, John Van Lew, and his wife Mary, my daughter, have requested that I not leave them anything because they have plenty." An odd way of putting it. But he does make one bequest to his daughter Mary. He leaves her a slave. And that's kind of ironic because this is 1858 and the Van Lews are busy freeing their slaves. And actually they're going out and purchasing other slaves that are related to their slaves that they're freeing, so those people can be freed. And here he is giving his daughter a slave. But strange things happen, right? Okay, now we're going to move on. It's wartime, 1861. And the Confederate flag is now raised over the city of Richmond. And the Battle of Manassas takes place. And the South has all these northern prisoners that they have to house somewhere. And they march them through the streets of Richmond. Elizabeth and her mother see them. They see these men tired, worn, bedraggled looking, wounded in many cases. And they see them march to Libby Prison. Now, Libby Prison was originally a tobacco factory, like it's down on the water in Tobacco Row, they called it. But by this time, it is a ship's chandlery owned by Mr. Libby and his son, and it's also a grocery store. But within 48 hours, the Confederacy comes in and takes it over and makes it into a prison for officers. So they house their prisoners there on the second and third floor. Now Elizabeth and her mother are very upset about this because after all, they're really Northerners at heart. They are approached by the good ladies of Richmond and asked to please come and help them make shirts for their boys, and they decline. Well, this doesn't make them too popular. The newspapers, without naming them, actually make comments about them. But, so to appease the people, Elizabeth and her mother decide that they're going to do one thing for the Southern boys, and that's to go out to the camp and distribute Bibles. But in the meantime, they're much more interested in helping the Northern prisoners. So Elizabeth goes and she asks the commandant of the camp. I'm calling him commandant. They actually called him prison keepers. And his name was Lieutenant Todd. He happened to be the half-brother of Mary Lincoln Todd, or Mary Todd Lincoln. So he refuses. He says, no, a woman of her social status should not be taking care of prisoners and should not be taking care of sick men. And besides all that, there's a lot of people in Richmond who would prefer to see these men die anyway. So she doesn't stop there. With great determination, she keeps going on, going to the top. And she finally gets to General Winder, and he gives her a pass because she charms him. She said he's an old fool, that he is easily charmed. All you have to do is flatter him. You get anything out of this general that you want. And she gets her pass. And with the sizable fortune that they have, and that's also criticized in the newspapers, her and her mother are buying bedding and clothing and bringing food to the medicines and everything to the Union prisoners there. And it just so happens that she meets one Union prisoner who's kind of a famous name. He was captured in the Battle of Manassas, and he is going to be hung. His name is Paul Revere. He's the grandson of the Paul Revere. And a special friendship is supposed to be developed between them. Now, if you read some of the novels that are out there, you'll hear all about the great love affair that Elizabeth had with Paul Revere. It's not true. He was 10 years her junior. He was married, had 2 toddler children. There was no love affair. She just took an attachment to him. And remember, she was one who wanted to preserve the Union. So quite possibly this attachment was nothing more than she was kind of in awe of meeting Paul Revere. Well, at any rate, the reason he was going to be hung was with 14 other people that were selected because the North had captured a ship called the Savannah, which was doing privateering, and they were going to hang those 15 men for being pirates, rather. So they were going to reciprocate in the South and hang 15 officers in this prison. But cooler heads prevailed, everything blew over in time, and he wasn't hung. In fact, he was later exchanged, Paul Revere, for another prisoner from the southern prisoner that was in the North. It was all officers, of course. He was a colonel. He goes back and does join the army again. He dies the first day at Gettysburg. He isn't killed in battle. A shell actually hits his tent and kills him. However, Elizabeth keeps this work going, and she continues it all through 61, 62, 63. And we have another picture, and there's what the prison looked like. And it's a great interior view, because it said that the men up on the second floor could look out the windows and see troop movements. And this is when she starts spying on a very small level. She actually goes in there and she brings apples, a basket of apples, and they have messages hidden in apples. And she has a plate that she brings in with a false bottom where you put hot water, and it turns out that they put messages in there. The men are giving her information to get to the outside. One point, she's not allowed to speak to them anymore, but she can bring them books. So she brings them books, and they make little pinpoints underneath certain letters so that she can read the messages. And right now she's in more like a letter writing campaign. She sends off the information and letters to people in the North, supposedly relatives, but they are getting up there to the generals. Now, by the time 1864 rolls around, though, the Union Army is getting very, very close. They're right outside Virginia there. And it becomes more important to get information to them. So some of the men that had escaped from Libby Prison went back to the Union lines and told them about what a wonderful person was down there, how kind and thoughtful and everything she was. And they decided, well, let's send an emissary down there and see if we can get her to do some spying. And of course, Elizabeth agrees immediately. And I think we have the next slide. And she sets up a whole network by herself. Quite a brilliant thing to do for a lady who lives such a sheltered life. And she devises, this is her cipher code. This was actually found hidden in her watch after she died. The code was used in sending out information to the Union lines. She had General Butler on one side, General Grant on the other, and this is how she got her messages out to them. Now, as far as getting these messages, she set up 5 different points. One point was her house in Richmond, second point was her farm outside of Richmond, and there were 3 other locations. Now she used the people who were her slaves, who are now freed and continued staying with her, as her emissaries. Nobody paid much attention to this old black man that she had working for her that would take a wagon out every morning from the house in Richmond out to the farm to get produce. But if they paid attention to him, they would notice that when he returned in the evening, he had on a different pair of shoes. Because part of Elizabeth's spy ring was also a Quaker shoemaker, and he made special shoes for them with the soles hollowed out so they could put messages inside. Now, most slaves only had one pair of shoes. Hers had 2, so that would lead you to be suspicious in the first place. But nobody paid attention to the elderly black man. Nobody paid much attention either to the black girl that would go around with eggs. Of course, one of them was hollowed out and would carry messages too. So from this way, they got from one point to the other the messages and got back to the troops in the Union, and they knew all the movements and everything of the troops. She had 12 people that were spying for her. Not only did she have a shoemaker, she also had a quilt maker who sewed messages in quilts. She used her own 2 people, as I say. She also had a person that was in the adjutant's office who could tell all about troop movements. She had a person in the map office that was able to make up the maps. All these people worked for the Confederacy, but they were all working against them. She also had a man named Mr. Ross, who was an officer in the prison. And he was the most hated person by all the prisoners there because he was abusive. He would come in and push them around, take them off the questioning, and they'd never be seen again. Well, the people in the prison felt that these people were probably being taken off and tortured and God knows what, probably killed because they never returned. But in actuality, he was taking them off, and once he got them in his office, he provided them with a Union a Confederate uniform, so they could sneak out during the night and walk around the streets of Richmond and get themselves to the Union lines. She had many ways of devising all kinds of methods to get messages and everything across. It was pretty amazing. The next slide shows us a secret room in her house. In February of 1864, just when she started the spying operation, we had this secret room. She set it up because they were going to plan a very large prison break. And in fact, they did. They got out over 100 men in a tunnel, which they tried to dig, and it took them 3 attempts to get a tunnel that came up underneath the shed so that they could just go into the shed and walk out the front door of it. About half the people were recaptured. But for those who made it back to the enemy lines, again, they're bringing information with them, and they're telling all about Elizabeth and her exploits. And she establishes this kind of place in a wall here where she could hide people, and it's discovered when the house is torn down in 1911. Her niece, Annie, said that she actually saw her bringing food up to the people and things there. Okay? All right, in the meantime, she has a brother, and the brother's in trouble here. They owned a hardware business. The family would like him to leave and go up to Philadelphia to his other sister because they're afraid that he's going to get inducted into the Army. So John Van Loo is afraid to leave. He doesn't want to lose the business because they will confiscate the hardware business. So he decides to go into the Army, and Elizabeth pleads for him that he's not a well person. They give him a desk job. But Grant is right outside of Richmond now, and he's put in a unit where he's going to have to go to the front. So John Van Loo decides to desert then, rather than go to the front. And here we have a series of newspaper articles that are quite interesting. We can read them. Gone to the Yankees. J. Newton Van Loo, for many years a hardware merchant of the city, has gone to the Yankees and is said to have been taken by Beast Butler, that was their nickname for General Butler, as a special protector. Van Loo, notwithstanding an incurable disease which rendered him unfit for anything, we should think, being conscribed about the time Grant made his flank movement to the south side, one evening rode out in his buggy in the direction of Malvern Hill and has not been seen since. If he displays any brains in his new character of detective, it will be for the first time in his life. Kind of brutal, these newspapers, aren't they? I don't know what his incurable disease was, but of course we don't know if Elizabeth made up one to keep him out of the service or whether he actually did have a problem. But then we have another newspaper article the next day. Okay, denied. The statement made by us in Wednesday's paper that J. Newton Van Loo had voluntarily gone to the Yankees is denied by his friends. We are informed by Mr. Elijah Warren, who is Mr. Van Loo's agent here, that Mr. Van, being about the 1st of June last on a visit to the house of a friend in Hanover, was captured and carried off by a Yankee raiding party. Since this event, none of his friends have heard anything from him, by letter or otherwise. We shall only add here what the chief of the Confederate police says. He says Van Loo rode out from his friends in Hanover with in his buggy. And the buggy came back, but Van Loo didn't. It's, and we say, damn strange. If the Yankee raiders took Van Loo, that they didn't take in the buggy too. From the same authority, we learn that Van Loo is certainly at Bermuda 100. Now, we have yet a third article. Okay, and this is his friend responding. In your paper of the 28th instance, I read under the head of Gone to the Yankees, a misrepresentation of the whole matter. The facts of the case are these. Mr. Van Loo came to my house in Henrico County on Friday, the day previous to General Lee's army, and remained with me and my brother-in-law, Mr. P.R. Moment, who was doing conscript duty and cut off from his family, who were at his farm Studley in Hanover within the Yankee lines. Towards the close of the week, when our scouts came in and reported the way clear to Mr. Nolan, who of course was all anxiety about his family, he determined to go home and see what damage had been done to his family and property, and Mr. Van Loo, who had formed quite an attachment to him, remarked he would go down with him, as the way was clear, and see how he fared, and both started off together. Well, anyway, we'll just get to the bottom of this, and they do attest to the fact that Yankee cavalry captured him and took him prisoner. Well, I think if he was captured, and I believe he probably was, it was probably all orchestrated by Elizabeth, because it did two things. Number one, it kept the hardware business because he didn't desert, and number two, it kind of took the heat off of her too. She has a brother who was captured by the Yankees. How could she be a spy? Well, she was really, her spying activities weren't too well known, but she was considered a traitor for all that she was doing. Okay? Alrighty. Pretty soon the war is over. But I have to first tell you all about one of her main spies. There is a woman called Mary Bowser, who actually was a spy for Elizabeth. or at least that's the way the story goes. She was supposedly have a photographic mind, and she was somebody that the Van Loos had taken an attachment to when she was a very young child. And they arranged for her education. They sent her up to Princeton, New Jersey to be educated. And she also was baptized in the Episcopal Church across the street when she was 6 years old. And she was supposedly born into slavery at their farm. She does have white blood and some ancestry, white ancestry. And she has gotten married, and that's why her name now is Mary Bowser. Her name was Mary Jane Richardson originally. Well, it seems that Elizabeth got her to work in Jefferson Davis's house as a slave. And she worked the tables in the dining room and listened to conversations. She also went into his office and read secret papers, and with her photographic mind, she did all this and passed on the information to the bakery man who would arrive in the morning with the bakery goods for the family. The only problem is, and when I told this story for the first time in 2015, I would have sworn it was all true. But since 2019, some letters have resurfaced from the Van Loos family, and the whole story has fell apart. It seems that Mary Bowser did do work with Elizabeth in the very first years. She actually accompanied her to the prison and took part in those little activities. But by 1864, when the severe, dangerous spying took place, she had already moved out of the city. In 1861, she had married Mr. Bowser. She went up to Princeton to school, and at the age of 15, the Van Loos financed a trip for her over to Liberia, where some freed slaves had established a community. She went with a minister and another group of people to do missionary work there. And she was quite miserable. She really hated it. And she kept after the Van Loos to bring it back. And within 5 years, they did bring it back when she was 20 years old. But Mary Richardson Bowser made a mistake. She went around the city of Richmond telling people that she was a freed slave. And Virginia had a law that if you were a freed slave and you left the state, if you returned, you lost your freedom. You actually could be resold back into slavery. So they arrested her. First thing she does is give them a phony name, which didn't work out too well either. She called herself Mary Henley. Well, somehow the Van Loos found out about this, and Eliza went and talked to the police and said, no, she's really my slave. Her name is Mary Jones. They gave her yet another name, and she took her to live with her in the house. Eliza had to pay a fine because she was letting her slave run around the city of Richmond. But she was able to take her home, and in fact, in the 1860 census, she is shown as a servant in the house, Mary Jones. And she's shown, too, as a mulatto. Now, she married Mr. Bowser in 1861. The marriage was not successful. If you read some of the novels, he died tragically a few months later, but that's not true either. They just broke apart in time. She, by the end of 1865, right after the Civil War, we actually find her up in New York, and she's giving lectures about her exploits as a spy with Elizabeth. She lectures at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, and she's also at a church in Brooklyn. And she herself, the words out of her own mouth, are telling how she helped Elizabeth in the early years go out to the prisons and deliver the goods and things. But the one time she was in Mr. Jefferson's home, Jefferson Davis's home, was to pick up washing. And she went into his office and kind of snuck around a little bit, and he came in and caught her, but he let her go. So much for all the big spying. But it was a good story, and actually it was a story told to Harper's Magazine in 1911. They wanted to do a story about Elizabeth, and nobody knew the name of the spy because Mary Bowser just kind of disappeared from view because she got married again. So they went to the niece, Elizabeth's niece, Annie, who now lived in Massachusetts. She had married in, I think it was, let's see, I think it was 1875. You wonder who would marry them, because after all, they were a family of traders down there in Virginia. But a man came from England in 1867 after the war, and she married him. His name was John Hall. And after 2 years there, they moved up to Massachusetts and made a new life for themselves. Well, they were always after Annie to give them details about what went on, and she always pushed them away, saying, you know, I was a child. I was a very small child. I didn't know what was going on. But when this man showed up from Harper's Magazine in 1911, she had great clarity at this particular time. And she told all about Mary Bowser, the slave. So they finally had the story and her name. And the story was, of course, what Annie concocted here, that she spied with her aunt. In time here, we see that Mary Bowser was kind of a strange person in a way. She started teaching at the Freed School down in Virginia, but in 1867 she tells them she's moving to the West Indies to be with her husband, and it's an entirely different husband. It's a man named Mr. Gatlin. And there is no Mr. Gatlin apparently, because a couple of months later she ends up teaching in another school in Virginia. Then she marries a Mr. Denham, and Mr. Denham is a white man in Georgia. They have yet to be able to find the marriage certificate for that, but that doesn't work out because of the interracial problems in Georgia. So ultimately she ends up back in New York. And that's what this new correspondence that came to light in 2019 is. There's an actual letter from her, signed M.J. Denham. In the letter, she is living in Greenwich Village, New York. And she is talking about her problems, economic problems. The letter is to Elizabeth, and she thanks Elizabeth for helping her financially. At this point, Elizabeth can, because as a reward for her service, General Grant, when he becomes president, appoints her to the postmistress job in Richmond. She also gives a job to her brother, too. The hardware business isn't doing so good. And poor Elizabeth seems to be caught in this letter. Her ex-slave here is complaining about being poor in New York financially. She's having trouble making it, and the people aren't very nice up there either. They're as racist as they are in the South. So she has given her money to return to Richmond, but in this letter she says, I'm sorry, I'm not returning. I don't want to go back to Richmond. I don't want to have to be grateful to you for what you've done for me. So I'm staying here. And I spent the money you sent me, and I bought clothes and paid off debts. And more or less, she hints keep the money coming though. So she's kind of and caught. I think what happened to her, she was kind of caught between two worlds. You know, she was with the white world, she was with the black world. She was really caught up in it and really didn't know where her place was. But after that letter, she again disappears from view, and right now we haven't found her. There is a woman that's been working on it for years. She wrote a book, I think, a novel, really, and she continued with the story about the spies because she said that's what people want to see, you know, that's what they want to read. But she says a historian in me has to admit that it's not true. So she's trying to bring the truth to light. There was also a lovely picture of Mary Bowser, but it wasn't the same Mary Bowser. She was kind of suspicious, this historian was, because the clothing, the dress, was not of the time period. And it turned out the photo was taken of a person named Mary Bowser in 1900. By that time, the first Mary Bowser would have been about 60 years old, and this was a woman in her 30s. So this woman is still, this historian is still researching and trying to find out if, again, she might have changed her name. The short bit I read about her, she had 7 different names. Even when she lectured in Brooklyn and Manhattan, she used different aliases then also. So we don't really know where we stand with her. She did say in one of her lectures, too, that her mother was white and her father was half Indian and half black. They don't really believe that either. We do know she must have had white blood, but if it was a mother, I don't understand how she would have been born into slavery. The other way around you could understand, but a white mother and a black father, it is doubtful she would have been born on a farm into slavery. But in any event, that's the story about Mary Bowser. Now, Elizabeth herself, in 1867, goes up and spends some time with her sister. I think they got her out of town too, because everybody was really mean to them down in Richmond. Her brother, in the meantime, when he got back to Union lines, he didn't join the Union Army or anything. He went to live with his sister in Philadelphia, Anna Paulina. By 1867, the war is over and he's returned home. And he's quite a man about town here. This is very interesting because this is a jury that's been formed to hear the trial because of Jefferson Davis for being a traitor. And what's unique about this jury is they have 24 men on it, 12 are black and 12 are white. And John Van Loo is seen sitting on the floor there with the straw hat. That's him, looking pretty dapper there. Now, John in time here starts up the hardware business again, but of course it wasn't very successful. So they're really living on this income from her being a postmistress, and he is also working for the post office. But unfortunately, General Grant can only stay president for 8 years. And after the 8 years, things become a little harder again for them. But in the meantime, he has sent that daughter Annie. She went off to school up in Pennsylvania also, so they couldn't have been too destitute. And she, as I say, married and moved off to Massachusetts. And John here is going to start looking for a wife shortly. But I think the next one, okay, we have yet another picture of the close-up of John with the straw bottle. Okay, now, John Newton. John Newton decides to look for a wife. Now, where does he find a wife? It's kind of hard in Richmond. Everybody still hates him. In fact, Elizabeth is telling how when she goes out for a walk, the people cross the street and walk on the other side of the street. She said brave men come up and shake their fingers in her face and everything. So John finds a wife in upstate New York. Her name is Augusta, and this is a picture of Augusta with her sister Mary. And she's barely 20 years old, Augusta, and she marries this man. John by now is more than 20 years older than her. In fact, he's 3 years older than her mother. Now, John doesn't just marry Gussie, he marries the whole family, and here's how come. Gussie is actually a Van Loo. It's a cousin. As I mentioned previously, Frederick had Aletta, my ancestress, John, Elizabeth's ancestor, and he also had the son Frederick. Gussie is a descendant of Frederick. Frederick had moved upstate New York, and so Gussie was living upstate, and I assume they made some family connections. And she looks like she had a pretty unstable life up there. 1850, it's her mother, father, and sister Mary, and dad's a farmer. By 1860, they're living in Nashville, Tennessee, in a rooming house. Dad's a bookkeeper. Okay, 1870, the family is split up. Gussie is back with her mother in upstate New York. The father is down in South Carolina with her sister Mary, who's now married. Well, John marries her in 1872, and I think it's a marriage of gratitude. He's glad he could get a wife, and she's glad he takes in the whole family, and I mean the whole family. In 1880 census, they're living in a small town outside of Richmond. It's John, Gussie, 3 children, the mother-in-law, the sister has passed away, but they got the brother-in-law and their 3 children, and John's a retired merchant. I have no clue what they were living on. The brother-in-law is a farmer, they say, but I don't know how that supported that whole group. So there's still money floating around. Don't kid yourself. They didn't lose it all in the Civil War in spite of what everybody says. They might have been cash poor because they spent a lot of money on all these extra things. But okay, in 1875, moving along to the next one. And this is the mother's, yeah, this is the mother's tombstone. Elizabeth Baker Van Loo passes away in 1875, and carrying this theme that these people were so decimated by the Civil War, her obituary actually states that her mother had to be buried without pallbearers because they were too poor to pay for them. But at the same time, look at the monument that's put on her grave. So if you can't afford pallbearers, I don't know how that monument got put up there. But it is a very beautiful monument, and sadly, the mother has passed away. So really, now the head of the household is Elizabeth. She's living there alone with John's daughter from the first marriage, Eliza. And Eliza is somehow incapacitated because Elizabeth talks about taking a walk with her chair, and how the people are so rude to them. They go to the other side of the street. There's no social life. The two ladies are living in this big old house all by themselves. After they no longer have the postmistress job, financial situation gets a little tight, and they have to make an appeal for money. So Elizabeth appeals to the friends that were up north, the family of Paul Revere. And they are so thankful for what she did for him while he was in the prison that they get together with some other families up north, and they establish an annuity for her so that she gets income from that. And she's able to hold on to the house. That's mainly what the aim at that particular point is. We have another picture here of a family group, and I only came across this very recently. I dated for probably around 1879 because that's when Annie got married to John Hall. She had 10 children, by the way. One of her children applied for the Sons of the Revolution, and he's the one that supplied the death date for Mary Carter West. He was a colonel in the First World War, and he was also a professor at Yale. This family picture shows Elizabeth, her two nieces. That's John, and there's a little boy with his back to the camera, and that's probably John's oldest child by his second marriage. He had a little boy, John. He had actually 5 children, like I see. Okay, and what do we have next? Alrighty. And I can't see. Oh, okay. In 1891, Anna Paulina, the sister down in Pennsylvania, passes away. And this is her tombstone in Pennsylvania. It's the Clark family. Okay, we'll move on. Alrighty. Okay. The brother John, now in 1895, he becomes ill. And I don't know if he doesn't trust the doctors in Richmond or what happens, but he decides to go up to Philadelphia to his wife's family, all these physicians seeking help. He goes up there and he lives with one of his cousins. And unfortunately, it doesn't work out, and John dies up in Philadelphia. And I showed 2 obituaries here. One's from a northern paper, and one's from the Norfolk Southern paper. And you can see the contrast between the 2 of them. And it's kind of hard for me to read, I'm sorry, because of the light. But the one down the bottom says John Newton Van Loo, who was a hardware merchant in Richmond before and for a short time after the war, died in Philadelphia yesterday. He was a Union man and a brother of Miss Elizabeth Van Loo, postmistress of Richmond under the Grant administration. Okay, that's nice. Northern newspaper kind of has to explain why this Virginian, I guess, died up in Philadelphia. They're making sure you all know he was a Union man, that they're not harboring, I guess, a Southerner. But the Southern newspaper is entirely different. Okay, I'll see if I can read from my notes. Mr. John Newton Van Loo, who was a hardware merchant here before and for a short time after the war, we're in agreement, died in Philadelphia today. He was a Union man. But they add, and a brother of Miss Elizabeth L. Van Loo, whose devotion to the Northern causes made her quite unpopular here. Mr. Van Loo held a position under his sister, when she was the postmistress of Richmond under the Grant administration. 30 years after the Civil War. And the newspaper is still saying, well, she was quite unpopular here, okay? But she is still alive, too. So she's reading this in the local newspapers also. Okay? And here we have Elizabeth again in her later years. She looks kind of beaten down at this point. She's living, as I say, in that big house with her sister, with the courtesy of people who are making payments to her to keep her going. Her whole life is her garden and her home. She doesn't want to give it up. Her health doesn't seem to be too bad, but Denise's is bad. And in May of 1900, Eliza passes away. She's only 40 years old. Elizabeth is so devastated by the loss of her niece that she dies a few months later in September 1900. There's no money for a monument. This is a case of having property but no cash. So again, the friends up in Massachusetts come to her aid and place a beautiful monument, which I think maybe the next slide. No, we got yet another picture of Elizabeth in her house and gardens, enjoying her final years there. And here we go. There's Elizabeth's monument. They brought down that piece of granite from the people in the back seat. They brought down that piece of granite from up in Massachusetts, and they put on this plaque, and it says everything. It sums it up for you. She risked everything that is dear to man: friends, fortune, comfort, health, life itself, all for the one absorbing desire of her heart, that slavery might be abolished and the Union preserved. She's buried in Shopton Cemetery, and quite a popular person now, even though she was vilified while she was alive. She actually now is in several Hall of Fame, a Spy Hall of Fame, and she's pretty renowned. I actually ran into somebody while I was on a cruise out west, and on a riverboat, and she was from Richmond, Virginia, and I mentioned her to her, and she said, "Oh, Miss Elizabeth, we love her. There's a beautiful exhibit in the museum down there." They actually had set up a museum of the Confederacy, they called it, and they did give her a place of honor, and it was in an old Confederate building. Recently, they actually moved it now to an ironworks, and they call it the Museum of the Civil War. And they're getting a little bit more politically correct, I guess, down there. Elizabeth's house, her beloved home, now belongs to Annie. She left it to the two nieces, and Eliza has passed away. Annie is up in Massachusetts, has no attachment to the home. She sells it for $13,000 in 1901. Nobody wants to buy it. Who wants to live in a trader's house? Even though it's 1900, we still haven't gotten over it. So it's bought by a club and used as a clubhouse. A few years later, a doctor buys it and uses it as a sanitarium. And in 1911, in a final act of bigotry, as one person stated it, one historian, the house is demolished. It's one of the most beautiful homes in Richmond, but it's demolished. They needed to build a school, and they selected several locations, and the good citizens of Richmond turned them all down. You couldn't tear down a building that was associated with the Confederacy. You couldn't tear down a building where the Chief Justice Marshall lived. There was a lot of to-do that they couldn't tear them all down. But when it came to saying, let's tear down Elizabeth Van Loos home, they were all for it. Down it came, and that's when they found this spy room, a little hidden place to keep the prisoners that escaped. And she also buried her journal, by the way, in the backyard. And unfortunately, part of that got destroyed. But there are fragments of it. And it's in the New York Public Library, really. In fact, that's where I found the family picture, too. Okay, I like to look ahead and see what happens to families. The only surviving people of the Van Loos now that are down in Virginia is John's widow, Gussie, and her family, her 5 children. Okay. That's her obituary. Gussie's 5 children, they lived a very middle-class life. After John died, they no longer lived in the small town. They actually moved to Roanoke. Her one son worked for the telephone company. Her other son worked as a machinist for the railroad. I almost said Long Island Railroad. The railroad down there, and that was the Richmond to Roanoke Railroad. And remember, Hillary Baker, their uncle, actually was a treasurer for this railroad. Now he's working there as a machinist. Gussie is kind of my hero in this story. As a 20-year-old girl, she goes off and walks into this hostile area there and marries a man that is considered a traitor. His whole family are traitors and everything. But she carries on quite well. And it turns out that she moved to California with one of her daughters, but she comes back for a visit, and she passed away while she was on the visit. And if I can see the dates here again, I've got glare. It's August 1907. What's interesting about this is the date is August 19th. Gussie's birthday was August 19th. So Gussie has come home to visit her son John, who lives there, to celebrate her birthday. And she actually dies that day. What's even more interesting is I found the son's tombstone, and he was also born on the 19th of August. So they were celebrating a mother-son birthday when she passed away suddenly. So that's rather sad. But I have to say, I read all of her obituary, all about her children and everything, and I said, you're not mentioning anything about the other Van Loos. They don't want to know for nothing about them. But in the very final paragraph, they said, Mr. John Lou was the brother of Miss Elizabeth Van Loo, for many years at the head of the Richmond Post Office. The Van Loo home on Church Hill is one of the best-known residences in the city, hadn't yet been torn down. We go to the next slide, we see that Gussie has this beautiful monument erected over her gravesite. She's not buried in Richmond, she's buried in Roanoke. And they do identify down the bottom there too that she is the wife of John Van Loo. By the way, her husband, John Van Loo, does not have any monument in Choctaw Cemetery. At the time of his death, I guess there wasn't a lot of money to go around. I'm gonna move, and I think this is the last slide. And this is John Van Loo's son, John, probably the little boy in the picture. He was born August 19th, as we see, 1873. He died October 7, 1945. His death certificate says he was retired machinist for the railroad, and it tells us what he died of, and maybe this gives us a hint of what chronic disease that possibly John Van Loo suffered from. He dies of diabetes, and it can be inherited, so possibly that's what John had his entire life that made him unfit for anything according to the newspapers. So that's kind of the story. There's a lot more here, but we can't stay forever. So thank you very much. I'll be glad to answer them if I can. So, anybody?
How did you remember all that stuff?
I'm sorry?
How did you remember all that stuff?
How do I remember?
I
was living with it for
genealogy, and I forget who's who, carried the line down.
Well, I've been doing family history. My sister and I started back in about 1988, and I was into a lot of the Dutch history. We did a lot of research long before there were computers. We used to go to libraries and blow dust off books that were sitting on shelves for 50 years and nobody ever opened. And we really got into it. In fact, we never referred to it as genealogy. Genealogy to us is, people gather a name and a date of birth and a marriage and a date of death, and sometimes they don't even do that much. But they have 60,000 people in their family trees. We always refer to it as family history. We like to read between the lines. And I read between a few of them here. And I'm very curious about the birth of Mary Richardson. She's a mulatto. She got a lot of special attention from the Van Loo family. They took her in, educated her. I just have to wonder if there isn't something more behind that too. You read between the lines when you look at the obituary for Augusta and you see, born, died, and oh my gosh, it's so true. So she wasn't just back on a friendly little visit, she came back to visit her family to celebrate her birthday, her son's birthday. There's always something behind the story. You can look at something as simple as a census record or an obituary, and you'll always find something else there. And that's what I like to do. And I think I inherited my memory from my mom. They always said in my family, if you had a question, go ask Annie. That was my mother. She just had it all in her head. She knew every single relative, who they married, how many children they had, where they worked for a living. She could tell you the exact address. We used to take little walks around East New York. She was one of 12 children. And I swear every child was born in a different location because they rented and they kept moving for cheaper rent, you know. So we would walk down the street and my brother Johnny was born here, my brother Frankie was born here. And she had a fantastic memory, and I think that's why I inherited from her.
My mother-in-law was like that.
Mhm.
Every story that she told me, I found the evidence that proved the story.
She never had a note on anything. People used to call her up in the family when there was a dispute and say, okay, tell us, you know, something she preferred to keep hidden. She kept them sacred, truthfully. I think the love of history probably came about at a very young age, too, because my father passed away when I was only 6, and it was in 1943, at the beginning of World War II. And my mom used to take us to the cemetery. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery. And at certain holidays, special days, we would come out and we would take the trolley along Myrtle Avenue and go to Cypress Hill Cemetery to our father's gravesite. And our father was the Dutch ancestry. He was in the family plot for his mother. It's the Sedan family. And I could stand there and see like 4 generations in front of me from the time I was like 6 years old. One of them was in the Civil War. And I didn't only visit my grandfather's grave, it was my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandparents, my second or third great-grandparents. From the time the cemetery was open, they had this huge plot right there in front of me. So it was very easy to get interested in history. And as I said, even on my dad's side, they go back to the Quakers, so we also have an interest there too. So, but I want to tell you too that if you're interested in war, there's a lot online, but it is very questionable, a lot of it. And if you buy any books, expect them to be novels. They are not telling the true stories. And if you're interested in knowing more about those Cornell Betts people, I can recommend a book called Kill Strangely. It's about the death of Rebecca Briggs Cornell. She was murdered supposedly by her son. It is not a novel. It tells you all about the supposed murder, gives you all the insight into the trial and what was going on in those days in the 1600s up in New England. And it also explores the possibility that you can have a gene that kind of makes you violent. That because there are a lot of other interconnecting people in that family who have resorted to violence and also suicide.
What is the name of that book?
The name of the book is Kill Strangely.
Kill
It's
Strangely.
by Elaine Crane, and it's the death of Rebecca Cornell.
Thank you.
Very, very interesting. I would recommend it. I guess that's it then. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. We'll come downstairs and we've got some refreshments.